This is Outrageous History.
Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. In the spring of 1934, about a year after Adolf Hitler became appointed as Chancellor of Germany, he took an unpublicized trip to Norway on the German battleship the Deutschland. The sparse news reports seemed to suggest it was almost a sightseeing tour. Apparently, the Führer and his entourage were duly impressed with the sights. As it turned out, it was a harbinger of what was yet to come, and that was the total occupation of Norway by Germany in 1940. This is how Professor Despina Stratigakos launches her most recent book, Hitler's Northern Utopia, Building the New Order in Occupied Norway. But Hitler's sightseeing tour through the fjords of Norway was not the most unexpected aspect of the book, and really, neither was the occupation of Norway. What was really astounding were the plans Hitler had for Norway as part of his grandiose vision for the Greater German Empire following his expected victory in war and subsequent dominance of Europe. Professor Stratigakos is a professor of architecture at State University of New York, Buffalo, and she's here with us today. Glad to have you here today, Despina.
Oh, Ernest, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Despina, just about everybody is familiar with Hitler and the Nazi Party's massive attempt to roll over Europe and the Soviet Union, and of course, its depraved plan to exterminate the Jewish race. But your research in your books created a whole new perspective of this part of history, and that is Hitler's plans for the world during peacetime after conquering Europe. Now, as you note in your book, there are several crucial aspects to those plans, but can you describe what Hitler had in mind?
So, what is fascinating about the Norwegian occupation, and what I focus on, is the enormous amount of building activity, construction activity that happens during the occupation. And at first glance, that might not seem unusual. They were, fortifying the Atlantic Wall. They were defending against what they thought was going to be a British invasion. But what I realized, and what tells us about this future that you're pointing to, is that a lot of that construction was for peacetime. It was for the period after the war had ended, and Hitler thought that the German forces and his military would be victorious. So what Norway shows us, and why this book is both about sort of the unknown, let's say, history about the Norwegian occupation and beyond Norway, is that it shows us what the Nazis were planning for the world under the swastika, because they have already started building it in Norway. It's not theoretical, it's not abstract. It's actually under construction, that world in Norway. So we glimpse what was to come, and it is a truly frightening vision in a different way, because now we're looking at the world as imagined after a Nazi victory.
So much of this has to do with Hitler and many of the members of the Nazi Party's obsession with what they call their Norwegian race and the Viking connection with the history of Europe. Tell us about that.
Right. So most histories about the Norwegian occupation focus on the military strategic reasons for that Hitler had for occupying Norway, and also on the heroic resistance. what I was interested in is why, once Hitler occupies Norway, very rapidly things start to progress toward some kind of vision that goes beyond those immediate wartime strategic needs and goals. And to understand what that vision is, you have to look at the racial hierarchy that the Nazis had for Europe. And most of us, I think, are familiar with that hierarchy in terms of Eastern Europe and the ways in which the Nazis placed in their conception Eastern European populations, particularly Jewish and Slavic populations, at the bottom of that racial hierarchy. And for them, they planned a truly horrific fate, which is genocide and slavery. And the cities of Eastern Europe that they associated with Slavic and Jewish populations, they planned to just raze. Then there's the other end of that hierarchy, the apex, that I think is not as well understood. And at the top racially are not the Germans, but the Norwegians. And the Nazis saw the Norwegians as possessing kind of the racial holy grail. And that is, they had, in the view of Nazi eugenicists, the purest so-called Aryan blood. And so they had something that the Nazis desperately wanted, and to infuse that into the German population to uplift the Germans racially. So because of that perception of the Norwegians as having this super blood, they treat the Norwegians differently from other occupied nations. Now, this idea that there was a Germanic brotherhood between the Norwegians and the Germans is not an idea that the Nazis invent, but they instrumentalize it for their racial goals. And so the part of what I look at is, how does that then play out on a broader sort of empire level? And I look at, for example, the infrastructure that the Nazis built in Norway. So a lot of that construction was infrastructure building. And some of it is, is not surprising: roads, bridges, things that the military might need. But other aspects of that infrastructure are very surprising, because they are almost dream projects that don't really have that much of a function, but are being put in place to reinforce this German, Norwegian, Nordic brotherhood in order to be able to exploit it later in peacetime. Some of that is like an autobahn that is planned to go from the tip of Norway all the way down to the south of Austria, and that's going to be a new northern-southern axis to reinforce the closeness of the Nordic brothers. But other things have to do specifically with this idea of Aryan blood. And so, for example, they also build what is effectively a pipeline to bring Norwegian babies down to Germany. So I look at the full idea of what does it take to build a racial empire? And there you really do need to understand sort of this hierarchy and how it plays out differently in Norway than what we see in Eastern Europe.
Well, yes, some of those plans to expand that Aryan race had some very practical ways that played out. So let's talk about this, the Lebensborn program, which, as you mentioned, began in Germany in 1935 to boost the German birth rate, specifically of Aryan babies. Uh, but because it was aimed at single mothers in Germany, it didn't quite fly there. So the Nazis expanded that program to other occupied countries. This seemed like a particularly nefarious concept in that it was such an open expression of the Nazis' belief in what they considered their Aryan lineage.
It is, and it was hard to research, hard to write about, and even today when I go back and review for an interview like this, it's really hard to read that those children. There were by war's end, there were hundreds of children still in Norway in institutions waiting to be moved down to Germany, and they were not well treated after the war by the Norwegian government. And so these children who were, selected by the Germans for their supposedly superior genes after the war were treated as having almost degenerate genes. And so it's very hard to read about that history and think about what happened to those children and as adults and their ongoing struggle actually for justice. The Norway was the Nazis built the highest number of Lebensborn homes, which means font of life, in Norway. And again, you see these ideas kind of developing on the ground almost during the occupation, according to these ideas that were simmering in terms of ideas of race and culture, but that take off once the occupation is in place. And you're right, they first try this in Germany, doesn't go very well. And then in Norway, about a year after the occupation starts, the occupiers realize they have both a problem and an opportunity, which is that the German soldiers and Norwegian women become involved. There are pregnancies that result. For the Norwegian women, this is a very difficult situation. They're often rejected by their families for their relationships with Germans. And the German occupiers realize they have potentially a very valuable asset in these pregnancies. And so they very quickly begin to build homes for the pregnant Norwegian women. And they continue to build these homes right up until March 1945. So this becomes a real focus for the occupiers, or I would say a priority, and even at a time when building materials are extremely scarce, labor is extremely scarce. Nonetheless, they really push forward these homes in order to capture, these pregnancies. And from an architectural point of view, what's really interesting about them is that they're all repurposed buildings, so they haven't had time yet to develop a new architectural type in this case. But they take over quite nice properties, quite nice hotels, for example. And so the homes themselves are quite luxurious, let's say, in the context of the time. And this also indicates how the value that the German occupiers are placing on these, so-called racial assets.
Uh, yeah, as you mentioned, it was a high priority for the Nazis, but the consequences of those relationships with the German fathers were quite serious following the war. So, what happened to the mothers and the babies?
It is a tragic history. Now, some of there had been, the idea was that the Norwegian babies would be sent down to Germany in most cases and adopted, but adopted by sort of the cream of the cream of Nazi society, the SS and their wives. But what happens is that the the Germans who are supposed to receive these babies are skeptical about the mothers. They're like, well, they're morally suspect, the mothers, because they were not wed and they gave up their babies for adoption. So in fact, it's not so easy to place these babies who are brought down to Germany, and so they go into orphanages. In Norway, the babies are being collected at this one central place in Oslo, and being prepared for shipment down to Germany. And many of them were there when the war ended. Some mothers did keep their babies. Not all were put up for adoption. When the war ended, the mothers were seen as, and women who'd had relationships with Germans were seen as traitors. And in some cases, they were actually arrested and with the children. And so there was a question of what to do with them. There was a desire among some to ship these women to Germany, which really would have been a kind of death sentence, because Germany after the war was, of course, in terrible, terrible shape. But they were treated very badly. And it was only in 2018 that these women and children, most of the women, of course, by that point had passed away, did receive an official apology from the Norwegian government. Many of the children who were in institutions stayed there, unfortunately. There was a really horrible kind of backlash against them. They were seen as, quote, German brats. Some people feared that they would become, grow up to become German spies. And there was one Norwegian doctor in particular who claimed that these children were mentally deficient, and that sort of also really influenced how they were seen. So unfortunately, many of these children stayed in the institutions and grew up there. So it really is a very, very tragic history, and reminds us of the very real human cost behind even the programs that the Germans, that Hitler thought would bring Norway closer to Germany. And he really believed that he could befriend the Norwegians through these kinds of programs. So that tells you something about it. The other very human cost to these infrastructure programs was paid by the prisoners of war that were brought from the Soviet Union and also Yugoslavia and other areas to construct them. So the highways, this crazy Northern Railroad, Arctic Railroad that Hitler wanted to see built, but all these vast construction projects were worked on at a certain point, or especially in northern Norway, by prisoners of war under really horrific conditions. And many of them died and are buried in Norway.
Well, Now closely tied to the vision of this great German empire, was his insistence that the automobile would sort of be the catalyst or the means for the German race to populate all of these conquered areas. And in addition, as you were just mentioning, he had this huge, if not impossible, plans for building a railway to Norway's far north. Just tell us about these superhighways and the fate of the polar railway.
The highways and the polar railway can be seen as this effort to kind of create some kind of framework to bring into some kind of control this ever growing, geographically expanding empire, and a way to kind of bring it into, closer to Berlin, which was to be the center of this new Aryan empire. And the highways are, you're right about the role of the car is very interesting. I think many people know about the role of the Autobahns in Germany, but Hitler also had a very car-centric view of this empire, Aryan empire to come. That and as it is expanding, one of the really interesting things I realized when I was working on this book is that the military successes of Hitler's armies are actually a problem in some ways, in the sense of, as you grow larger and larger and this empire starts to take form, those peripheries are really far away from Berlin. So how are you going to tether things? How are you going to keep the focus on Berlin? How are you going to keep the fringes of the empire from getting out of your control? And there are other historical precedents we can look at in terms of strategies. But for Hitler, the car is a very important way in which to create tethers. So he imagines that after the war, he's going to build, his engineers are going to build these superhighways throughout the conquered territories, and that the Germans will get into their Volkswagens and drive off to see these conquered territories and get to know them. And for Hitler, this is very important because the Germans getting to know and identifying with those territories is critical. At some point, he says they will have to defend these new territories. So he wants people to get out there and get to know these new lands. So they become these kind of very important tethers. The Northern Railway, the Arctic Railway, Polar Railway, seems to have been also this way to kind of conceptualize and start to frame and contain the idea of the Greater German Reich. And it was completely an unrealistic and really quite crazy project. And he was very much discouraged by his own leadership of pursuing it, but the Norwegian projects become these passion projects, and he won't give it up. And I think it's because for him, this is really about shaping that empire. And so they're very, very meaningful, these kinds of things. The other way in which he's dealing with this problem of this expanded empire and how to keep it under control and keep Germans German is through the spaces that the German occupiers start to build for themselves in Norway. So that too is really interesting because it tells us what they're thinking about in terms of their relationships with people in the conquered territories, even in places like Norway, where on the one hand, they want to biologically sort of merge with the Norwegians, but the architectural spaces show us that they don't actually want to culturally merge with them. They want to hold themselves, the Germans want to hold themselves apart as rulers. And so they're really creating boundaries through the spaces they build for themselves.
One of those examples uh, of creating their own space within Norway was this completely audacious plan to build a whole new city in northern Norway, but not just another Norwegian city hosting a naval base, but actually a brand new German city.
Indeed, and it was going to be the largest city in Norway at the time. It was planned for 300,000 Germans, which would have made it larger than Oslo at the time. And that's actually how I began to research this book. I was in the Bundesarchiv, or the German Federal Archives in Berlin, working on another project, Hitler at Home, and looking at Albert Speer's papers there. And I came across this folder, opened it up, and it was about this city, in this city of 300,000 people just outside Trondheim, so southwest of Trondheim. And I didn't know, like, I was just completely flummoxed by this. I realized I didn't really know much about architecture or planning during the Norwegian occupation. And a project like that large, it doesn't stand alone. Like, there's going to be other things around it, a bigger vision. You don't just build a new metropolis without there being other things going on. So I went to the library, got myself a book on Norwegian architectural history to just find out, how do I think about this huge city, and discovered when I turned to the table of contents that the table of contents jumped from spring 1940 to, I think, July 1945. So there was no chapter on the occupation, and the implication was that nothing interesting had happened architecturally in that period. That's why it wasn't in the book, right? But I had just seen in the archive this file for this new German metropolis in the north, so I knew that there was a history there, and that's what eventually got me started on this project, was trying to understand what I had seen that day in the archives. So this new city was a secret, which is, I think, one of the reasons actually we don't know more about it. It has taken a lot of work to try to figure out what was being planned. But if you look in the German archives, you do find enough to start to sort of understand this project. What really helped me was that I was generously given access to a private collection, the papers of Albert Speer's second in command, Hans Stephan. Hans Stephan was a young architect working with Albert Speer on the redevelopment of Berlin into Germania. And when Norway was occupied and they started to build these new projects in Norway, he became the liaison between the German occupying government, the Reichskommissariat in Norway, and Albert Speer's office. So in this private collection is all of the correspondence about Norway between Stephan and Speer, all the reports, all the inside information, including their plans for this new city. So the new city was going to be, it started as, first the Germans were looking for a naval base. And so it starts off as a new German naval base, but then very quickly, as these things do with Hitler, once he has an idea, it just starts to like blow up. So from the naval base, very, very quickly, it becomes and attached to the naval base will be this glorious new German metropolis in the north. And this is a city of 300,000. It was going to have it was going to be a cultural gem. Hitler wanted to be the cultural patron of this city. He wanted there to be everything that, you know, a cultural metropolis should have. So there was going to be a beautiful new art museum dedicated only to German artists, and Hitler was going to curate the collection himself. There was going to be an opera house. There was going to be everything that you would want, and beautifully built, according to their ideas of beauty, of course. And they start, then there's the question of who's going to design it. And this is a plum architectural project. And so as you can imagine, the architects in Hitler's circle all wanted, because to be able to design a city from scratch, I mean, how, you know, that's an incredible commission. And Albert Speer is determined to be the one to receive the commission. When it looks like he might not, he actually pitches a major fit and tells Hitler that he's going to quit designing for the Nazi Party. And in the end, you know, Hitler gives this to him to placate him. So that's how it develops. And then Speer did develop designs, which we haven't found yet, but I am convinced are out there. However, they do start to build the naval base. They determine where they should build at, and they actually start to do that. And you can still go there today and you know, see rebar poking out of this fjord where they were planning to build it. So they're the Norwegians got lucky in the sense that the turn of events in the Soviet Union and the turn to total war meant that a lot of these projects in Norway had to be halted, although Hitler didn't want that. He really had no choice, and put on hold until, again, after they've won the war and they think they're going to emerge victorious. So the plans get halted, and for that reason were not developed more fully than they were. So, but that city's going to be only for Germans, right? So, here we have this. We see it on a smaller scale as well, with other spaces that the Germans build for themselves, but this was going to be an entire city only for Germans, and it was going to be the cultural capital of the northern part of the empire. The Nazis didn't like Oslo. They felt it was very American. They didn't like the modernist architecture. They felt it was degenerate. But it was obviously very convenient, its location, so they do set up the center of the occupation there, the political center. But the cultural center is going to be in this new city. It's called New Trondheim. And one of the attractions of that location is its association with Old Trondheim, the existing Trondheim. And Trondheim was the capital of the Vikings. And this is an association that the Nazis want to take on for themselves as the new Vikings. So they choose the location very carefully in terms of the messages that they want to create around this new northern cultural capital.
And Hitler was fascinated by art and architecture. He and his architects had some very specific principles when it came to designing not only the imperial state of Germany, but also of the occupied regions, as you're just speaking about, specifically in New Trondheim.
They did. Hitler, as I think many people know, had artistic architectural aspirations as a young man. Those aspirations remained, although not on a personal level in terms of going to architecture school and becoming an architect, he saw architecture as incredibly important for the success of an empire. And he said, wars come and go, but the art and architecture that a nation creates remains. So he saw that as the architecture and art as the highest sort of expressions of a culture. And so he wanted to leave behind these architectural remnants of German greatness and throughout the empire. But also, this was a way to moving up beyond the spaces that the Germans were creating for themselves. Architecture was also a very important way to shape the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft. And the Volksgemeinschaft, which means the racially unified community, was a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. And very early in the 1930s, the Nazis begin to plan new cities in Germany that will be laid out according to principles that will help people to become a part of and to strengthen the Volksgemeinschaft, the racially unified community. So in 1934, for example, they complete a city called Lehndorf, which is in Braunschweig today. And this is a city that's laid out according to the principles of the Volksgemeinschaft. So at the center, you have this, they call it the Aufbauhaus, which translates into kind of resurrection house, that has an elementary school, but it also has a hall where people come together to meet as a community. It has all the authorities, the Nazi authorities Hitler used. It has a memorial to the fallen in the Nazis' early struggles. It's sort of this hub of the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial community. Even the art on the walls, everything is geared toward this idea of this unified racial folk. And to live in this community, you had to pass a racial medical test, like you had to be checked out by doctors, and you also had to pass a political test in terms of your ideas. And the way that this whole community is constructed is, again, around the center with parade routes that come to the center. The parade routes are the streets, and those are created as a kind of political theater in terms of the way the architecture functions as a backdrop. So you look at this community and the architectural styles, the layout, the institutions, the concentration of power in the center, the kinds of institutions as well. Everything is geared towards promoting this idea of the Volksgemeinschaft. And it becomes this all-encompassing stage set. You're a player in a play that you can't escape, right? And the stage set is all around you. When they occupy Norway, 23 towns in Norway were very badly damaged in the invasion. And Hitler saw this as an opportunity to create similarly a new kind of, when they rebuild, to rebuild the Norwegian cities in a way that will, like in Lehndorf, create this sense of a Volksgemeinschaft so that he can start the process of transforming Norwegians into good citizens of this Aryan empire to come. Because although the Norwegians have this supposed superior Aryan blood, they're viewed by the Nazis as in other ways being degenerate, particularly culturally, because they have been influenced by England and the US. And they also are seen as having problematic personal traits as Norwegians. So they're considered very stubborn and not very prone to thinking in terms of community and other sort of faults in terms of becoming citizens of the Greater Reich. And so the rebuilding of the cities, which is done under the supervision of Speer, the Norwegian cities, is meant to start to transform the Norwegians, among other sort of uh, efforts, into these docile members of the Volksgemeinschaft. So architecture is incredible, and city planning, incredibly important in terms of the social life that was the social and political life to come in Norway, but already actually happening in Germany, that would center around the party, and that would bring people into this, again, this idea of a unified racial community.
The Germans like to think of themselves as the maybe older and wiser brothers to the Norwegians and incorporating some of these principles. But what was the reaction from the Norwegians to this? What really was a mass colonization of their country? I mean, did they buy into that Nazi propaganda?
It really is incredible to think that Hitler thought, you invade a country and then you befriend the people. Um, as I think most of the histories of Norway show, there was a very fierce resistance, and Norwegians are very proud of the resistance. There were some who were very much leaned toward National Socialism. There was a puppet government led by Vidkun Quisling that was absolutely on board with many of the ideas of National Socialism. They did think that the Nazis were eventually going to leave because Hitler told the Norwegians that that was the plan. But when you look at the architecture, and this is extremely important, those infrastructure plans, the city building plans, the other spaces that the Germans are building for themselves, it is crystal clear that the Germans are not leaving. They're planning to resettle the north. They were never going to leave, but they're not telling the Norwegians that. So there is a group that, a piece aside, there are some Norwegians who welcome the invasion as a way to transform Norway more along the lines of National Socialism in Germany. There's a lot of gray area that hasn't been really part of the histories that have been written since the war. The narrative has been, for good reason, more about the resistance, and it tends to sort of create a picture that's black and white in terms of good guys and bad guys. And now, in the last, I would say, 10 years, there's been a younger generation of Norwegian scholars that's beginning to look at some of these gray areas. So, for example, in all of those infrastructure projects, there were many Norwegian companies that profited from those plans. And, I think that has taken a long time to start looking at more of those gray areas where there was more collaboration sometimes than we might expect. But another dimension to this that makes it, that complicates the picture, is that the Germans, the occupiers, were not, they withheld so much from the Norwegians. And I mentioned the fact that they weren't ever planning to leave, being a really big thing that they were withholding. But also, as I mentioned before, the plans for New Trondheim were secret. They knew that this would enrage the Norwegians to find out that the Germans were planning a huge metropolis in their country. And they also were careful about those Lebensborn homes. They weren't exactly secret, but they weren't super publicized. With the town reconstructions, I think the Norwegian architects were working on that under Speer, you get a sense from the correspondence between Hans Stefan, Speer's second in command, and Albert Speer, they're definitely withholding things as well. They kind of tell the Norwegians as much as they think they can without telling them too much. But they were also withholding information, for example, from the local municipalities, because there was a democratic tradition of urban planning in Norway, and they knew that local town councils would be extremely upset to find out what the Germans had in mind. So in this correspondence, it's really funny, you have like Terboven, the Reichskommissariat, Speer and Hans Stefan and others sort of like telling each other repeatedly, make sure the local town council doesn't find out. So it's also interesting to see sort of who they fear. So in that regard, I think that some of the reaction was contained through being very secretive about some of these projects.
This next question, you've kind of touched upon this here in this last response, but to conclude your book, you wrote that it's taken decades for the Norwegians to comprehend and to confront what happened to their country. Do you think they've come to terms with that?
It's a big question. I would say there has been an incredible body of scholarship that has been written about the occupation, and as I mentioned, much of that has been about the military history. Has also been about the resistance. But these projects that interest me and that are, foregrounded in the book, the building projects, what the city, the rebuilding of German towns, the spaces that Germans were building for themselves, the infrastructure, that that has not been as thoroughly studied. In large part, it is now sort of coming out, but in large part because the main archival sources for that information, or much of the archival sources for that information, were part of this vast archive of the engineering division called was under the Organisation Todt in Germany, which there developed the Autobahns, the Atlantic Wall, and other things. In Norway, that division, its archives, which, as I said, are vast, was only opened to scholars in 2011. And that was in part because there was so much material. And also, at the end of the war, there was an effort to try to destroy things or throw things into big heaps so that they wouldn't be easy to reassemble. That it took decades to organize that archive. And I can't remember now, I can't tell you, like just the sheer volume of it is gobsmacking. It's just huge. But it took that long to just get it, sort of assemble it, take, this huge mess that the Germans had left on purpose, put it into folders and give scholars access to it. So I started to work on that a few years after it had opened, and it will generate, I think, new kinds of histories. But as I also mentioned, there's with time, and Norway's a small, in terms of population, geographically it's a huge country, but in terms of its population, it's small. And so I think that it's taken time to get to a point with, I think, a new generation of historians who are interested in and able to kind of go into some of these gray areas. And so they're also producing new histories, looking at, for example, the use of slave labor in the construction of these projects, infrastructure projects that were in many cases still in use after the war. So one of the things that the Nazis did was to build or expand airports, which was something that was used in Norway after the war. There was expansion of roads. The Polar Railway wasn't very useful, but there were other things that, and so the fact that this was built by slave labor, for example, this is like one of the gray areas that's difficult to look at. To think that there may have been some kind of economic gain out of the suffering of others. So it's taken time, but there is really exciting scholarship that is coming out now looking at these new areas. And so I think it's going to continue to generate these archives, but also these new perspectives are going to continue to generate, I think, surprising histories about the Norwegian occupation, and then also, about the world that the Nazis saw under the swastika.
Well, Despina, it's really fascinating and kind of eye-opening to hear this whole other component of what is somewhat disturbing. But we appreciate you bringing this aspect of history to light for us. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Ernest.
And I thank all of you for tuning in. For online information about this and other podcast topics, log on to outrageoushistory.com. When you do log on to the website, don't forget to register to access the Outrageous History Members Lounge, where you'll find all sorts of information in the podcast deep dives and author deep dives. You have to register to access the lounge, but it's free and easy to do. Thanks for listening. I'm Ernest Granson.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.